Alrighty, everybody. Today we have a very special guest in the classroom. He's one of the most beloved teachers in Australia, loved by the Australian public and by teachers and students alike. Eddie Wu, welcome to the classroom.
Thanks so much for having me, Kat.
Such an honor to have you here.
No, pleasure's all mine.
So I want to start with how you even got into teaching, because you've been teaching for more than 16 years now. And so how did you get into it? And more importantly, why are you still in the profession?
Fantastic question. I feel as though I was in that very thankful but small group of people who were able to work out relatively early that I had a career progression that I was like, this is the direction that I want to go in. I remember going to school with a lot of people who, frankly, had so much brains, they didn't know what to do with it, right? And they weren't called ATARs back then, but they got marks at the end of school that were literally like, the world's your oyster, do whatever you like. And a lot of them, and I still talk to students who feel this now, they thought, oh man, I don't want to waste this super high mark and maybe I'll go and do X. Whether or not that was actually a really good fit for their personality and what they were driven to pursue, it was probably around year 10 for me. So I was like 15, 16 years old. And it occurred to me that I love helping other people learn things. And I have some modicum of skill with it. Like I had friends who would come to me during English class and they'd say, explain this play to me. Like, what's this character about? And I would tell them and they'd be like, that makes sense. And then they would go and get better marks in their essay than I did. But they'd always come back to me. I'm like, you guys are better at English than me. Like the exam marks prove it. But it was something, I guess, about the way that I verbally processed or tried to explain a concept. And that's something which I feel very privileged that I've been able to continue growing in. And of course, I had some fantastic teachers too, who were inspirations to me. And they showed me the incredible difference, the impact that an educator can make on a young person's life. And I thought that would be an amazing thing if I got to have that same opportunity.
Did your parents ever pressure you into the Asian 5?
The short answer is yes, but I went into the course that I wanted with a remarkably small amount of opposition. I mean, I had an older brother and sister who went into fairly successful careers, and then as the third of three and one who had access to all these educational opportunities, I'd be lying if I said there wasn't definitely some disappointment in the air when I said, I think I want to become a teacher. It's not the profession that pays the best or has the most status, the highest status. So there was definitely kind of a, really, are you sure you want to do this? But credit to them. Like I have met and encountered and like interacted with so many migrants who've come to this country. Education is a gateway for them to a life of prosperity, security. I totally get it. And as a parent myself, looking at my own children who are now getting on and thinking about the decisions they're going to make, I understand that my parents just wanted the best for me, right? But I feel very thankful that not just to me, but to my brother and sister as well, they said, okay, we think this might be the best decision, but it is your decision and you have to live with that. And I do remember my dad saying, look, whatever it is that you do, be really good at it. Apply yourself to that. And that should be true of you, whatever sphere or direction that you go into.
I think that goes for a lot of teachers in our field today. They're just trying to do the best for their students as well, in and amongst all of these constraints, complex workloads, increasing demands, precarious conditions. How have you been able to grow and sustain your expertise as you've been working in those conditions?
It's interesting because that question actually is part of an answer to the question I forgot to answer before, which is like, why am I still in this after this huge amount of time? And for me, the reason why I'm still in teaching is because, number one, so many of the things that drove and motivated me early on about becoming a teacher, being able to change the lives of young people, not only do they remain true, and so that original motivation is still valid, in fact, those things were more true than 18-year-old me could ever have comprehended. I'm not just a teacher of a subject, I'm a teacher of students, as all of us in the profession are. And so when I think about what's the reason why I'm an educator, it's not just so that I can instill knowledge and develop skills in my students. I get to play one small part in the role of shaping them as human beings. And me as a, you know, early career teacher just learnt more and more about the opportunities and the privilege of being able to do that. And so then coming back to your other question, how I've developed and expanded, I feel as though I have had the privilege of learning from so many experienced expert educators who many of whom took me under their wing without, I didn't earn that. They just kind of looked at me and maybe out of pity, they looked like, you have no idea what you're doing. You need help, buddy, right? I did teach for a significant amount of time early in my career at the school that I attended as a student. So I think part of them were like, oh, look, little Eddie's all grown up. He definitely still needs some help though. So it's through mentors, people who've coached me, through leaders who have taken it upon themselves to develop and cultivate me. And then I think the second piece of the puzzle is being able to integrate myself into a community of other teachers, both, you know, locally here in New South Wales, around Australia, even around the world. Technology and social media have a lot of things to answer for, but what an incredible avenue they provide to help us connect with like-minded colleagues and not so like-minded colleagues who can challenge the way that we think. And then I think the third thing is that there's probably like 4, 5, 6, however many, right? But it's that there's this whole world of research and evidence out there that I remember reading when I was at uni and not fully comprehending at all. I think because I didn't have the experience, I hadn't gotten out into schools and truly inhabited the problems that people have been trying to solve as they've written all of these different academic works and frameworks and things like that. And so being able to marry all those theories and ideas and concepts with what I'm encountering in practice and what I see out in schools, and then try to fit those together and put them into a coherent way of doing things. Those are the ways that I've found have been helpful for me to grow as an educator.
I love that. And I want to dive a bit more into the whole research and evidence aspect and marrying that together with your industry knowledge and your currency in maths as well. So a lot of the research and the literature shows that maths anxiety is a common thing, especially for students and young girls in education. And so even for teachers themselves, thinking about maths within their subject areas or numeracy as a skill can be very daunting and difficult. And so from your perspective, how do you see teachers become more empowered to reconcile those deficit kind of approaches of, hey, you know, I'm an English and humanities teacher, maths isn't my thing. I'm not really sure where to start with that. Can you speak into that from what you've understood?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Kat, what you're making me think of is this framework for teacher practice that I first encountered years ago. It's decades old now, from Clark and Peterson. And they talked about what are the factors affecting what people do in the classroom and why they teach in a certain way, ask their students to do certain activities. And they said that the 3 main immediate factors are knowledge, which makes sense because if you don't know how to do something, you won't do it. Intent, like what are you motivated to do? What do you want for your students? And then attitudes, beliefs, and convictions about what's important and what's true and what's effective, right? So coming back to what you asked specifically, so when we think about numeracy and mathematical literacy across all our different key learning areas, you can see all 3 of those at work, both positively and negatively, right? I know there are lots of, not just educators, people in the general population who they interact with and use mathematics all the time, but it's hidden from their own view. I've met accountants and musicians and people in hospitality, all of whom would articulate, no, I'm not a maths person. I don't really use maths much in my job. But actually, if you just dig beneath the surface just a little bit, it's there. It's not even doing a very good job hiding, frankly. So being able to say, okay, I know that there is maths in what I do. And in fact, I'm quite good at using that particular maths that comes up in my sphere. I was just earlier this week, I was observing an economics lesson from one of the teachers in my school. And he said to me, help me work out how I'm going to explain marginal rates of distribution to my students. And I'm not an economist. I wished I'd actually studied a lot more of it when I was at uni and at school. So I'm coming from the outside, not knowing what all of these terms mean. But the two of us, my colleague and I, we could come together and build each other's knowledge of how our content areas overlap and interrelate. Then there's the intention question. And I do think that for the most part, it's a common phenomenon that most of us don't really want to get outside of our comfort zone. That's why it's called a comfort zone, right? It feels challenging and uncomfortable, difficult to try and wrap our head around a thing that is outside of the subject area that we, if we're secondary, chose to go and study. Of course, in a primary context, if we're taking a generalist approach, that's even more challenging because you have to do that. You have a responsibility to do that. Whether you liked maths or science or English, these are things you have a responsibility to put time into. And so I know that's a huge challenge with a lot of the primary educators that I work with, and I love being able to try and support them through that. And then the last thing that they mentioned, attitudes and beliefs. I guess for me, trying to tackle this idea that do you believe actually that a deeper and a better and a richer understanding of the mathematics that's in your subject? Like, I'm not asking you to go dig down deep into some esoteric, weird concept. You're like, oh, this is stuff I forgot about at school. Everyone has their niche, but I'm convinced that mathematics is found everywhere and it's for everyone. It enriches and expands our ability to understand and navigate the world if we can lay our hands on these tools. Do we believe that? And I can understand why a lot of people from outside of the mathematics cafe wouldn't believe that. They haven't been given much of a reason to in the educational journey that they've had. So I view that as part of the work that I do in schools.
I think that's just mind-blowing. I'm thinking of earlier this week, actually, I was teaching my Year 12 legal studies class, and we were talking about the introduction of a sugar tax. What would happen if sugar was to be taxed? For every dollar, for every 10 grams, it would tax $1. And then I got my students to look up the most common drinks and the sugar contents and to work out the tax and then to say, would you still buy this? And if this was to become a law, then who would it be impacting and who would be most vulnerable? And I think being able to just dig below the surface, as you say, to find the maths in your area and how it's relevant and to make that known, I think it can be very powerful for teachers and students alike. But where does a teacher start with that digging? Like, what advice would you have for teachers to just even have that starting point of where do I look for to find the maths in my area?
It's a great question and not an easy question either, which is probably the first thing to say. Like, I don't want to misrepresent. This is hard work, right? And I don't want to convey that, here are the 3 simple steps, right? Like, I think there's a reason why this is something that so consistently isn't done well, or is done well in little pockets and sometimes struggles to get beyond that. I think probably the first port of call is actually to think about the fact that teaching, even though when we go into the classroom and we close the door and it's us with our students, despite being such a social profession, teaching can feel quite isolating sometimes. Like, it's you, the teacher, in the classroom, alone with your classes, working out what you're trying to do. And I think that I have grown as a teacher throughout my career directly in proportion to the humility that I was able to exercise in going to my colleagues and saying, hey, I have no idea where to start with this. You have some knowledge here. Can you help me? Right? And I know that one of my favorite things about working at the school where I'm at right now, Cherrybrook Technology High School, is one of New South Wales' biggest schools. And the combined staff room that sits at the heart of the school, it's got like 85, 90 desks in it, all different key learning areas. And I love that not only can I just like get up and walk across to a colleague without like scheduling a Teams meeting, I actually often overhear conversations that I never planned to interact with. And probably the people talking about it never might have imagined that there would be some crossover that someone else in the staff room might be curious about. But just by listening in on a conversation between two visual arts teachers describing Islamic tiling patterns and the stunning geometry that you find in those, it's like, whoa, I didn't know those existed. Tell me about them, right? I think about the first time I learned about Florence Nightingale, the Crimean War, and how she literally invented a new kind of graph to convey we're losing more people to disease than to the actual war itself. Maybe we should do things a little bit differently, right? These kinds of things, these kinds of stories are ones that come second nature to the teachers in those areas. So I think that we owe it to ourselves to look over the hedge a little bit and to learn from people around us who have all of that knowledge that, we could teach 20, 30 years and never encounter that on our own. We wouldn't even know where to begin. The second thing, and I promise I'm not just saying this because I'm on a podcast right now, but wow, what incredible opportunities we have to use all the different kinds of things we can access through the internet now. Educators from other countries, educators from the research that we can access now just by getting onto Google, even asking. Like, I've done this, and of course you have to use apply salt liberally where you need to, but AI today, which has read everything on the internet, and these large language models are just hunting for more and more stuff, right? Even though, of course, you should do all of your checks and make sure that what you're getting is not hallucinated by artificial intelligence, if you have something that you're curious about, that's a great starting point. I would never use that exclusively because, of course, there's dangers there, but what a great low-cost way to begin and say, I'm trying to understand how mathematics relates to my subject area, and I'm teaching this particular thing, the role of museums in ancient history. I'm just trying to understand that. Is there maths in that? For sure there is. What starting points can you give me? So hopefully those are some helpful pointers for people.
I love that. I love the whole analogy about looking over the fence, and I think it speaks to the importance of collaboration and working with other teachers in order to find those pockets of gold that we can really connect for our expertise. And it brings me to my next question about early career teachers, because there tends to be this assumption of when we get into the field, we need to know it all. Like, we need to have all the knowledge, and it can be really hard to just let that thinking go sometimes. And we can get really caught up with, oh, I need to be at the front of the class. I need to know everything because these students depend on it. So what advice would you say for giving that a release and giving that back to the student, making the student the focus and the learning the focus? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, there's a real tension at play in the question you just asked me, because I definitely remember in my first 5 years of teaching, for example, I taught at a very academically competitive school. And I remember being extremely nervous about students asking me questions that I didn't know the answer to. And I'd think, man, they're going to work out that I'm a fraud. And how am I going to be a teacher who can command respect in the classroom if I don't even know what I'm talking about, right? Now, to some degree, I want to say there's a right impulse behind that, because you know how they say students don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I think that is absolutely, unarguably true. But I think it is also true that once students do know how much you care, it just so happens that they do care how much you know. Like, you are the person who has to put in the work. It's part of our job to know thy syllabus, do that deep thinking and work to understand, what was this curriculum designed to do? I'm not just going to read a bunch of dot points off the syllabus and then say, what does the textbook say? I actually need to labor to think about how this was all assembled, what design principles and what concepts are really important there, right? But I think what can happen, this is that tension that I was talking about. And I know I sort of made this transition around like year 5 or 6 of my teaching career. It's a foolish thing to try to be the sage on the stage who knows everything, to try and pretend as if we are the font of all knowledge. That is equally foolish. Students can see through it, for starters, right? And that's not especially with your senior students, why would you not get on a journey with them as co-learners, right? In fact, I think back to in New South Wales, the highest level of mathematics you can study in the higher school certificate is called Mathematics Extension 2. I didn't study Mathematics Extension 2 when I was at school, and the first time I had the opportunity to teach it, and people talk about imposter syndrome, right? I thought this could go really badly, right? A student's going to stick up their hand, they're going to ask me a question, and I'm just going to full hit panic mode and not, I'll be frozen in front of the classroom, right? And I remember processing that fear and anxiety for myself, and I thought, you know what? I can't pretend to these students. These students are way smarter than I was at their age in mathematics. I'm going to come clean with them, and I'm going to say, look, this is hard stuff. I haven't taught it before. I'm going to do the work. I expect you to do it too, but we're going to get on this journey together. And to this day, I've since taught that course multiple times. I actually think the first time that I taught it, even though, of course, I've identified some ways where I'm like, didn't teach that very well. Can definitely improve on that. And I've since changed it, right? We're all human. But there are real aspects of some of those lessons, which I can still go back and watch if I have, the desire to, that I think, oh, those lessons are some of the best I ever taught because I wasn't pretending. And in fact, by being that vulnerable and transparent to my students, I could actually unveil to them the excitement that I had from having quite recently learned a whole new concept, wrapped my head around it. And that is an incredibly valuable commodity to our students. I think it's not usually talked about in the literature, but this idea of the curse of knowledge, that teachers, when they become expert and knowledgeable about something, forget what it's like to not know it and therefore become not very good at explaining it. I think there's another aspect to being so familiar with the concept that you're teaching that you forget how novel and amazing it is, and that becomes a boredom in the classroom that is disengaging to students. So I actually think that being able to embrace that and to say, yeah, I'm somewhere in between. I've done the work, right? I am the person who has the job of knowing what the syllabus says, and I've put effort into that for your sake, right? But also, I'm still open to learning. I'm still exploring new things, and we're going to do that together. I think those are really valuable postures to take into the classroom.
Yeah. I love that. I love how you mentioned about communication and getting on that journey together with your own students is so important. And I've heard you say this quote of communication is not only a tool for conveying thought, it's also for constructing it. So can you walk me through pedagogically, how does that impact your interactions with students?
Okay, it's a great question. And haven't you done your research, Kat? I'm impressed. Okay, I'm going to think about it in two ways. So firstly, I'll think about it from a teacher point of view, and then I'm going to think about it from not just from a student point of view, but what it is that I have my students do, right? So from a teacher point of view, it's first most important to say that when I talk about why I think communication is such a great way to process and construct your own thoughts. I mean, for starters, I'm literally doing it in the spot right now, but I think there is something that happens in our brains when we are forcing ourselves to try and articulate that for another human being. And I think so many of us have seen this in the classroom. We can pose a question to our students, say, go work on it for a little bit. And then particularly in maths, we might say, okay, so who's got an answer, right? Lots of hands shoot up. And then while their hands are still up, I might say, keep your hand up if you think you could explain that to the rest of the class. And then 3/4 of the hands will go down. And so clearly there is this difference between, I think I've got it, versus I could communicate this to other people. And Richard Feynman is the one who said, if you cannot explain something simply, then you do not understand it truly. So putting that effort into being able to saying, I think I can articulate this to another person, even imperfectly, I think that labor is enormously helpful to try and get straight the messy, tangled schema in our head of how we're trying to conceptualize something. So for me, as a teacher, what that often means is, and despite the fact that, as you point out, I've been teaching for a little while now, especially when I'm going to teach something novel, but even when I'm teaching something I've taught before, I will write longhand. And by the way, I mean write, I don't type it. I think there's something, I'm that age that something different happens in my brain when I pick up a pen or a pencil. And I love there's a quote that I learned a long time ago, which is that I know I'm going on a tangent, but I promise I'll bring it back. I know not how the light is shed, nor understand this lens. I only know that there are eyes in pencils and in pens. When I pick up a pen to write, and I write longhand, I picture my students sitting in front of me, and I think, what am I going to say as I begin this part of the lesson, as I try and explain this concept or this skill? I write the words out, and I cross things out, and I rearrange, and I generally don't look back at that manuscript. But if I have not done the cognitive work to write it the first time, I've seen it enough times. I'll get up in front of that classroom and it will come out as a garbled mess, right? Because I haven't done that work. So that's from a teacher point of view. If I truly believe that that's true for all people, though, then who am I to withhold from my students the opportunity to have access to that same kind of effort and work? And, I've got lots of reasons from a syllabus point of view to do this. In New South Wales, we have this sort of fine-tuned, specialized version of the numeracy proficiencies that you find in ACARA's, national curriculum. And we call it working mathematically. So this is not algebra or trigonometry or statistics. This is the kinds of skills that you use and you learn no matter whether you're doing algebra or trigonometry or statistics. So we talk about communicating, understanding, problem solving, reasoning, and fluency. And communicating is right there. It's a non-negotiable. It is not enough for our students just to be able to even correctly calculate, compute an answer. We have a responsibility to help them know how to write, draw, speak, so that they can get their ideas from their brain into someone else's. So I carve out and plan my lessons in a way to provide students to do that. And mathematics is a subject that has a bit of a reputation for being quite solitary and individual. And so I have to sort of go out of my way to provide opportunities for that. And whether that's getting up at vertical whiteboards and doing group work together, or whether that's literally setting an assignment where the task is not come up with the answer to this question, but explain that answer on camera so that your peers can have a look at it, and then you're going to critique that, right? Providing opportunities explicitly for our students to develop that skill is really important to me. So I guess that's one of the outworkings of that thought.
I think you just speak to how we can make learning visible in the classroom and not take that opportunity away from our learners. The more teachers are talking, the more we're doing the learning, when really we should be explicitly creating the conditions for our students. And so in terms of the cognitive work and getting students to do that, can you walk me through about questioning as a technique? Do you ask your students questions in the class? Do you give them the answer? What do you do in terms of questioning?
Questioning is so underrated as a skill. In fact, I think it's so underrated that, going back to those early years of my career that I mentioned to you before, I think in my first couple years, I was so ignorant I didn't even really know questioning was a skill that I should develop. And in fact, I still remember there was this very experienced teacher who mentored me in my first few years of teaching. And I remember I would get to a point in my lesson planning where I would say, for example, have a question I wanted to set to my students. I knew it was really important to set this kind of question because it dealt with a really important part of the syllabus. And I'd come up with an answer, but I just would not have a satisfactory way to explain that to students. So then I would go to Bob and I'd say, hey, Bob, I'm working on this question, and I wouldn't even get to the end of my sentence. Bob would take one look at the piece of paper that I brought to him, and within seconds, he would say something like, I remember when they set this in the 1995 HSC, it was question 8. What a doozy. Students really struggled with it that year. And I'd be kind of like, how are you even human? Are you just an encyclopedic robot who knows every question ever set in the HSC? This is unfair, right? And I had so many interactions with Bob like this that it set me on a trajectory. I'm talking about knowing the syllabus and doing the work for that, right? I wanted to be a teacher just like Bob, who could answer any question at a moment's notice. I wanted to have the answers for my students. And as I mentioned before, to some degree, that is a very valuable thing to do, right? goodness knows, one of those frustrating things is when I see my children do this. They pose a question to a teacher and the teacher doesn't know. And it's like, well, great. Like, well, what hope do I have, right? But I got to a point where I started to know a lot of those answers and I would give those answers. And then I started to realize that I was not helping my students by giving them those answers. If anything, I was short-circuiting their own ability to think through it because I was so proud of myself giving, demonstrating the answer. And that I think was the hinge in my career that taught me, hold on a second, I've got to get better, not just at giving answers, but at posing the right questions to elicit student thinking. And I think the longer I've taught, the fewer answers that I've given. And, when I have a year 11 and 12 class, after 2 years, I've trained them. They start to realize they'll call me over and then they start to ask some of the questions that you don't need to, I'll give you some examples of this in a second. You don't even need to know very much about the particular question a student is wrestling with to ask an initial set of helpful questions just to focus in that student's thinking. Things like, explain this question to me. Tell me what you're asking. What do you think this question is trying to do? Where do you think this has gone wrong? All of those are totally generic and they're not even mathematics specific entirely. And what would happen is a student would put up their hand and then I would come over and then they would start asking the questions of themselves. And the less I say, as you point out, the less work I'm doing and the more they're actually developing their own thinking. And so for me, being able to think about assessing and advancing questions and being able to say, oh, okay, this is not just me trying to diagnose an issue here. This is me trying to push you beyond. You're not a student who's asking me a question because you're struggling. You're asking me a question because you're bored. And actually what you need is something that pushes you beyond it. Like there's enough of a low floor and a high ceiling in this question that you, oh fast finisher, who is feeling pretty bored with this question, there are actually avenues that you can explore that will help you to learn as well. So I'm going to ask you some questions that prod you in that direction. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that was undercooked in me when I came out as an early career teacher and that I think I've developed over time.
That's so good. And I think you're cooking the right kinds of questions in a different space now. I mean, you're a professor of practice at UCID and you're working in these intersections of research and also being in the field as well. So in terms of your work in the research space and working with teachers on an everyday basis, what other things that you want teachers to be cognizant of as they're on the ground?
This is a really tough question to answer actually for me because in my work with, as you point out, University of Sydney and also with the New South Wales Department of Education, I have the privilege of being able to run professional learning in a variety of different contexts. Particularly, I love working in rural, regional, and remote settings because like Queensland, New South Wales is a big place and there is definitely not equal access to professional learning opportunities that all teachers need. And I definitely benefited from so much, not just early in my career, but all the way through, right? And so in a lot of those settings, I think one of the critical lessons that I learned early on is that it's not helpful. In fact, it's quite counterproductive for me to go in there and just start saying like, I'm the expert. I know what you need. Here comes my wrecking ball. Forget everything that you knew. I've got all of the knowledge. And if you just do this, your classroom will be great, right? How incredibly disrespectful actually to come in with that kind of attitude. And sometimes that's quite unintentional, but it is actually stunningly common in a lot of the professional development that I see. And so I guess I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I do think that one of the most important things that I can do is when I come into a context and I'm going to be working with teachers, before I can answer that question that you just posed to me, I need to do a whole lot of listening and I need to be observing and getting into those classrooms if and when people are ready for me to do that, because that requires a lot of trust and psychological safety to bring people into that space. And for me, I'm extremely hesitant now to say, hey, here's what you should do. I mean, I could pick out a few things. I could say, cognitive load theory, fantastic. Growth mindset, so useful. Formative assessment, we already just talked about questioning before, right? But I think that one of the most easy thing for teachers to do is to just become overwhelmed by so many different ideas and practices. And every time I've gone to, say, an education conference, I come back with 10 times as many ideas, strategic projects, different directions I could go in compared to what I have the time, mental space, and energy to actually implement, right? So I'd far more prefer to, rather than just kind of throw out, here are some general things, I'd love to spend the time in conversation, just like we're talking now, to say, hey, tell me what makes you tick. Tell me one of my team members, he loves using the phrase, tell me what's the pebble in your shoe, What's the thing that in your classroom really is bugging you, like, I know this can be better, right? Maybe it's with in the high potential gifted education space. You're like, I don't know how to expand these students and enrich their understanding. And I know I can do better than just going faster through the syllabus, right? Acceleration has a place, but it is certainly not the only way. And if someone said to you, hey, Kat, I'm going on holidays. And you say, oh, where are you going? Like, I'm going to Europe. It's like, oh, wow, that's going to be great. Like, you're going to spend 4 or 6 weeks there. It's like, no, I'm doing it in 3 days. I'm going to do all of Europe in 3 days. You would not be impressed, right? It's like, you're just missing the richness and the depths and the different alleyways to explore. So acceleration has a place, but I don't think in a mainstream way, it's the main way to do things. So if that was the question you were asking me, then I'd say, yeah, let's dig into that, right? But if someone came to me and said, actually, it's that I know I've got a lot of students who they've got so many gaps in their learning. Even though we aren't in COVID right now, we are still very much coming out of the impact that this global pandemic has had on all our learning. Mathematics isn't the only subject like this, but it is one of the most hierarchical subjects where gaps in learning are huge problems as you move further on through the teaching and learning progression. And so those are the students who I'm trying to work out. You talked about mathematics anxiety before. These are the issues that I'm wrestling with, and I'd go in an entirely different direction to help a teacher who's wrestling with that. So I know it feels like I'm not answering the question, but maybe I'm answering a different one, and hopefully it's helpful.
I think you are. I think you're answering in terms of, we need to puzzle our practice, but also find ways for top-down professional development to be married up with bottom-up teacher voice in that space. Yeah, I think there's just a lot of things to simmer on in that space, Eddie. So thank you so much for sharing about that. I think to close, what is it that you want to encourage teachers about?
Where do I begin? I'd probably pick up 3 notes that are sitting right at the front of my mind. I'm thinking about hope. I'm thinking about collaboration, and I'm thinking about research and evidence. Actually, I'm going to do them in reverse order, if that's okay. But I think that's the order of importance, which is I'm going to do it backwards. So, research and evidence. We talked about briefly before about internet and social media, and it is great having access to so much that you can just Google things. You can find so many helpful blog posts, videos, conference webinars, all those kinds of things that can expand our thinking, right? But it can be very overwhelming, right? And so what I want to commend to everyone is to, and particularly I know for mathematics teachers, reading words that come in sentences and paragraphs is not our natural, happy place. But I would also say that even if you're not a mathematics teacher, a lot of us, it's been a long time since we entered the classroom and have actually looked at something, read something, or listened to something that's deeply challenged our practice. They say one of the most dangerous phrases is because we've always done it that way. And there are so many things that we actually know. Let me just speak from a mathematics point of view. In mathematics education, there are things that we've known for 30 plus years that are effective or less effective. And yet we still cling to these ways that we learned ourselves in the past. And so it becomes our default. And so even though there are better alternatives available, we just kind of stick to this old path, right? And the way that we shake ourselves out and explore new things is by engaging with the research and evidence. And I think this leads on to my second point about collaboration. I encourage people to do that pick up a book like, I'm thinking about, say, for example, Craig Barton's How I Wish I'd Taught Maths, right? Or if you're a leader, pick up like Jim Knight's Impact Cycle, right? Like,
Or Eddie Wu's World of Maths.
I'm not trying to toot my own horn here. And frankly, I can think of so many other things that are real helpful, but pick up something, anything, right? And don't feel like don't do the New Year's resolution thing where you like bite off more than you can chew. If you pick something up, like start at something easy, listen to a podcast that really dives deeper into something that you haven't met before, but don't go into the 3-hour long episode if you've never done this kind of thing before. Start at something more digestible and just challenge your thinking, and then have a conversation. This is the collaboration part with your colleagues around it. I think that sometimes we can often feel that I don't have time to have these in-depth conversations with my colleagues around me. There's this paper by Coburn and Russell. There are a couple of researchers who were looking into teacher social networks in the US. And one of the things they noticed was teachers talk all the time. That's great. But often the content of their conversation is extremely superficial, right? And it's not as though superficial is bad. Chatting about your weekend is not bad. You're having making sure you ask someone to do a bunch of extra photocopies for you, or where's the assembly? What time's it finished? Like, those are not bad things to talk about, but they're superficial in that they don't really help us get better at what we do in the classroom. They don't expand our pedagogical horizons and expose us to new ways of doing things. And so what I would commend is to have those deeper conversations. And what I would say is, to those people who feel like, I don't have time for this, I don't think we have time not to, because I know I've taught ways in the past that were really inefficient ways of teaching. And I felt like I was working really hard. I was, by the way, but I was doing it in a way that actually was hurting myself. We teachers are so time poor. We don't have time for that, right? Life is too short to only learn from your own mistakes. You got to learn from others as well. So find a mentor, find a peer. Sometimes you got to look outside your own school. I mentioned regional, rural, and remote before. I know a lot of maths teachers, and obviously there will be English teachers, science teachers, all the rest, who they don't have a faculty in their school. They've got to pick up the phone or message someone. They've got to reach out to a network. Do it for your sake, for the sake of your students. The cost is too high for us to just teach the way that only we know how. We need to expand. And then I guess, because that does seem like a lot of work and I'm commending to people to do something hard, the thing that I want to finish on is about hope. Teaching is tough, but it is so worthwhile. And for me, now is a time more important than ever for our young people to have the generation before them investing in them, passing on to them the tools, the mindsets, the dispositions that are going to help them navigate an incredibly complex world, to be able to go into that world knowing that they have something meaningful to contribute, whatever that happens to be, and to say, hey, I'm the adult in your life who's going to advocate for you and support you and believe in you. I hope every teacher listening has a story in their mind that they can think of for the student that they've made an impact on, that no amount of money, no amount of time would replace the influence you've had on that student. For me, I'm thinking of a student who, I won't name her for privacy's sake, but I didn't know that through year 11 and 12, when I was her teacher, she was having an incredibly difficult time. She was wrestling with huge questions of mental health and had an incredibly unstable home environment. And that was expressing itself in lots of really hurtful, negative, maladaptive ways. And I could see from the outside that there were things going on, but I didn't know any of the details. What I did know was that she was someone who wanted to drop down to an easier course of mathematics, but I could tell by the conversations that I had with her, the questions that she would ask, she had it in her to succeed in this course that I was teaching if she applied herself. And I encouraged her to do so. I said, look, it's your choice, but I know you're capable of this, right? Fast forward 2 years, she walks across the graduation stage, receives a certificate from the principal, and she comes off the stage, she hands me a letter. She says, just read this after, we're all gone from here. But just like, thank you, right? And I open the letter afterwards and it says, Mr. Wu, I didn't think I'd be alive today to walk across this stage. And every teacher who I'd talked with at the start of year 11 said, you're not doing very well in this subject. Consider changing to this other subject. And that's not helpful advice when every single teacher is telling you that. And you were the only teacher who was trying to convince me to stay in your class. And I thought, well, maybe I'll give this a go. And so thank you that I'm still here and that I get to move on to the next chapter of my life. And who knows what that's going to entail, but I'm just really grateful that you got to, I got to get to know you during these couple of years. I get to work across a system that has incredible reach. I get to have an influence broadly, but diffusely across like 800,000 students and 2,200 schools. And I love having that broad impact. But nothing is as big, I think, as being able to change the life of one student for the better forever. That's an amazing privilege that I'll never get over. And I commend to everyone listening to hold on to that as their hope, because I think we need that hope on those hard days when we're exhausted and we don't really want to roll out of bed, or we don't want to stay up to mark those papers or write those reports. What we're doing has incredible moral purpose and dignity, and that's what I hope everyone takes away and is encouraged by.
I think we're going to end on that note, Eddie. What a beautiful message of encouragement. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and your expertise with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks, Kat.